Merhaba. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to our seminar on feminist foreign policy, the promise of feminist foreign policy. I would like to welcome all of you. We have distinguished Member of Parliament Utku Çakırözer with us. Thank you for joining us. We organize this event in cooperation with the Heinrich Böll Stiftung Foundation in Istanbul. Let me welcome David Bartelt and Cem Bijo. Thank you for the cooperation. And Professor Birgül Demirtaş will be the moderator of this event. I would like to share a little of my thoughts in connection with this topic. And as we have guests from Germany, I would like to begin with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and his Faust. In English, it sounds like this. Two citizens are debating about a topic, and one of them says, on Sundays, holidays, there's naught I take delight in, like gossiping of war and war's array, when down in Turkey, far away, the foreign people are fighting. This always impresses me a lot. So they talk about the peace that they live in at night, or times of peace abiding. And for the others, they say, let them break their heads, let loose their passions, so they can do whatever they want as long as we have peace inside us. So in German, it sounds as beautiful as this. Wenn hinten weit in der Türkei die Völker aufeinander schlagen. So even at that time, this weit in der Türkei, far away down in Turkey, uzakta, çok uzakta Türkiye'de kavimler birbirine girerken, pazar ve tatil günlerinde savaştan ve savaşçılıklarından söz etmekten daha iyi bir şey gelmiyor aklıma. This is so impressive because these citizens are not impressed or shocked by war and suffering as long as it happens down in Turkey, far away. They seem to enjoy peace, tranquility at home, while down in Turkey there may be conflict and war. I find this very cold-hearted, very inhuman indeed, but also absurd. So there is a lot of absurdity in it, because we can ask, how long can there be real peace in one place of the world as long as there is war in another place? How long can peace and harmony be enjoyed here while there is conflict and war there? So unless unrest, violence, military conflict, wars everywhere in the world are solved, we cannot talk about peace. So my conclusion from this is no one lives in peace until everyone lives in peace. So when we look back at the beginnings of our discipline, and here we have students of political science and international relations mostly, the discipline has begun with this quest of peace. Idealists had come together to find ways to overcome war and military conflict. They were shocked by the First World War, and they wanted to find a knowledge, a scientific knowledge with which to solve the problem of war. And the building of the academic discipline of international relations was based on this. It was about the search for peace. So since 1919, we have the discipline international relations, and the main search is for peace. However, we failed. We had the Second World War. We had so many wars following. It was a dominance of realism and realpolitik. And what was missing in all of these policies and politics was half of the population of the world, namely women. So we need to ask, where are the women? And in international relations, women lack. Feminists demand the inclusion of women. They bring out a challenge to the discipline. They ask, where are the women? This is an aim to end the invisibility of women. So it is the asking, the demanding for gendered lenses in all of life, society, domestic politics, and foreign policy also. Only if we have this, only if we have gendered lenses, only if we always ask, how does this affect women, can we conclude positively and add to peace. Feminist foreign policy, which will be our topic today, takes all of this into consideration and much more. We have rights-based policies based on feminist foreign policy. It is based on human security and human dignity, and the economic poverties aim at ending poverty and protecting the environment. Very shortly, Sweden was the first country to adopt feminist foreign policy. It has brought out a handbook. It speaks about the 3 R's: rights of all women, that the rights are taken into consideration. The representation of women is highlighted in all decision-making processes. The resources, women should have access to resources. And the 4th R is based on the reality of the problems of the women's lives. Here you can find the list of countries that follow feminist foreign policy. Sadly, Sweden had begun feminist foreign policy, but quit it last year after the change in government. But many others still continue. Also, Germany has feminist foreign policy. It's important to highlight countries like Mexico and Libya. So it is not only, in brackets, Western or economically developed countries, but also others who follow. So we're curious about today's presentation, today's speech by Ole Frahm. So please let me introduce David Bartelt for making his introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, this gives me the opportunity and the excuse to be very brief. Günaydın. Adım David Bartelt, Heinrich Böll Foundation, Türkiye, Temsilciliği, direktörüyüm. Şu anda İngilizce davet ediyorum. I'm learning, as you can see. Ole speaks really good Turkish. I'm still learning. Good morning, everyone. And my role is very simple. I want to say thank you. Thank you to Sohal, Professor Sohal Hanem, Yeşilyurt Gündüz, and also to, where is she? There. Zehra Yilmaz Yaci. The 2 of us approached us some month ago with the project on feminist foreign policy, and we will see into that in more detail, and probably, hopefully, we'll be here again with some result in this or another audience here in your wonderful university. And then, of course, our speaker this morning, Ole Frahm, my compatriot, my fellow countryman, but he's a cosmopolitan citizen. He studied in, I think, at least 3 countries and has been teaching in another 5 or so. I lost counting, actually. But and Birgül Demirtaş, who is helping us with the moderation. And I cannot end this list without mentioning Jem Bijo, our program coordinator for migration, refugees, and foreign policy and security policy at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Istanbul. So thank you all very much. And the only thing I want to say, thankfully, Sohal has already mentioned some of the principles, and you have seen the last one on the list is Germany. We are a German political foundation. Our task is to bring about democracy, human rights, and also positive changes to environment, stopping climate change. We do that with money from the federal government. So we report to the federal government, but we are also ideologically, programmatically affiliated, in our case, to the Green Party in the German parliament. There are other political foundations affiliated to the other parties. Unfortunately, we also have now a political foundation affiliated to the extreme right party, and there's just a fighting going on whether this foundation is going to receive funding in the same way as we do. Okay, but what I wanted to say is because our Green Party is now in government, and it was in the coalition treaty that feminist foreign policy entered German politics in 2021, and the German foreign minister is not only the first woman on this post in the German history, she's also from the Green Party. So, and she stands for feminist foreign policy as a person. And what she says, and that already became clear, I just wanted to point out, feminist foreign policy is much more than bringing more women into politics and raising their share in representation, which is the first R. But it is actually, as she said, I will quote her, it is more than a women's issue. Annalena Baerbock, that's her name, this our Minister for Foreign Affairs. She says, feminist foreign policy is more than a women's issue. It is supposed to be of benefit for everybody, everyone, and is definitely an important element of security policy in the 21st century. I understand Ole is going to focus on security policy, and I just want to end with with sharing a little sadness of mine and also transform it into a provocation for you. Since Annalena took over and this new government in Berlin took over, we have had the dreadful things that happened in Iran, especially to the women, and are still happening. The outbreak of the Russian aggression against Ukraine and the Ukraine war that is going on for will be 2 years in some weeks' time. And now the war in Gaza following the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel. And I really can't see, I mean, it's, of course, I know that some concepts, they are limited in their possibility of being effectively implemented. But I fail to see, even through wording and much less through action, I fail to see an attempt of implementing the principles of feminist foreign policy. Here, in these three conflicts with our government, I may be unjust, I may be wrong, you will tell us. But it shows us, I have been working for Amnesty International for many years, and that were the years where that included the Olympics in Beijing, in China. So every time we talked about China and the government representative would go to China, Amnesty said, okay, you have to address human rights and so on. And they address it somehow and nothing never changed. So this is from a human rights activist perspective, which I also am. This is like a rather sad experience. But as she said, it must be an element of foreign policy in the 21st century. And I hope that through this event and other events and more debate and more people getting involved like you, the next coming generations, someday we will have really a changed foreign policy in Germany, but of course also in Turkey and in every other country. Thank you so much, and let's have a good discussion.
Thank you very much, David Bartelt, and my apologies once more. I also forgot one thing more, namely, I forgot to thank Zehra Hoca, Zehra Yılmaz, who assisted me in all this process. It was a great cooperation for the preparation of this event, so thank you, Zehra Hocam. Now I will leave the floor for Birgül Demirtaş. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zuhal Hocam. Good morning. I would like to welcome you all to this very timely seminar on the promise of feminist foreign policy by Dr. Ole Frahm. Next year, we are going to celebrate the first decade of the official adaptation of the feminist foreign policy in world history. It has already been a success story, I would believe, despite Sweden has quitted its approach, as Zuhal Hocam mentioned, because it has already been a success story since 16 countries in total from different continents have accepted to implement it so far by trying to provide equal rights, equal representation, and equal resources for women in international politics. This is especially important as we are witnessing more and more conflicts and wars in the current global politics in the recent years. From Putin's regime's war in Ukraine to the violent conflict between Israel and Hamas, the post-Cold War international order is at stake more than ever. And when we think about the main decision makers in all those conflicts, we will notice that almost all of these decision makers are males. But in most cases, the majority of the victims are women and children, as we today witness the great humanitarian tragedy in the Middle East nowadays. And when we ask the question of where are the women, our answer is they are not sitting in the decision-making table, but they are among the greatest victims. In these turbulent times, we need to remember once again that the aim of the international relations discipline is to create a peaceful global order, as Professor Zuhal Yeşilyurt-Gündüz has already mentioned in her introductory speech. And the peaceful world order can only be possible with the equal participation of women in foreign policy. United Nations underlines that women's participation in peace-building processes increases the likelihood of reaching a durable peace deal. And during this era of conflicts, we need to pay more attention to the voices of women in global politics. And we need to raise our voice for gender equality in foreign policy as well. Since only with the active and equal participation of women, we can reach the global peace. In this respect, we are more than happy to hear from Dr. Ole Frahm what feminist foreign policy can promise us in the current global order or disorder. Before giving the floor to Dr. Frahm, I would like to share his rich biography with you. Dr. Ole Frahm has a background in politics, philosophy, and economics. He has his bachelor degree from the University of Oxford. And he had his master's degree in European Studies from the University of Bath, Paris, and Humboldt University, Berlin. Since obtaining his PhD at Humboldt University, Berlin, he has worked as lecturer and researcher in different countries, from Scotland to Algeria, from Turkey to Switzerland, in addition to his native country, Germany. Dr. Fram's research interests range from fragile statehood to democratization and the study of populism, to foreign policy, and theories of international relations. Currently, he teaches at the University of St. Gallen and at Leuphana University Lüneburg, and since 2022, he has also been a visiting fellow at Kadir Has University in Istanbul, the Department of International Relations. His current research focuses on how principles of feminist foreign policy can be transposed to the field of security policy. For early 2024, he is organizing a conference on feminist foreign policy and the Black Sea at Kadir Has University. Now, Dr. Frahm, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Right, that's a tough act to follow. Goethe and so many other things. I also have plenty of paper here, but don't worry, it's not going to be all paper. Yeah, first of all, literally, thank you very much for the invitation, because it's, and I think it goes without saying, it shouldn't be obvious, right, to have, as you were mentioning, right, to have a male speaker from the global north here lecturing about feminist foreign policy. So I think, and Tigna is clearly right, and I also come to her, that there's still a discrepancy when you look at the women and men in the field of international relations. However, I think, and maybe coming back to Goethe, just like a piece of art is clearly the product of the artist, in this case of feminist activists and feminist scholars that have been working on the idea of a feminist foreign policy and of feminism in general for many decades, really reaching all the way back to the end of the First World War, you could say. However, I think, just as with art, it helps when you expand the reach beyond the author and beyond the artist, and in fact look at the work from outside perspectives, interpret it, and engage with other actors. So to be clear, right from the start, I'm not going to be mansplaining feminist foreign policy to you as a man, but I'm strongly hoping to engage with you in a discussion. So while this is a lot of paper, I hope to cut it so much shorter so we have plenty of time to actually discuss what also you perceive and maybe also critically engage with it. But just to keep this uncomfortable slightly. I think it's nice to have a slightly uncomfortable interaction between audience and the speaker as well. Okay, but in this sense, maybe I also draw the line of how and why I think it's really important that other actors, men, people from other disciplines, those who are not convinced by the promise of feminist foreign policy, to engage with it. The first one would be, it's a general call from among the feminist camp. So I was recently at a conference in The Hague on feminist foreign policy, and one of the overarching themes there, apart from the war in Palestine, was the call, for instance, by Lyric Thompson, the head of the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative. She said on stage that we need to get out of the silo of women's movements, of just talking to the echo chamber. If feminist foreign policy wants to fulfill its considerable promise, and I certainly think that it has a considerable promise, then it has to engage with people that are allies or people that are critical of it. So that's a long way of circling around to my personal interest, which is kind of based on studying the especially the international relations of the Black Sea region and its wider region, so including Russia and the European Union. Struck me in this respect is that not just among the political class, but also among the scholars and the advisors that are working on the region, there is still a prevalence of thinking of politics and thinking of international relations, but also thinking of conflict as a zero-sum game, of clearly using what I would consider largely outdated political theories like geopolitics as something as a given. And the clear problem here is that, and it comes back to what Cyril was saying, that that those ideas have consequences, right, and quite deadly consequences, as we see certainly in Ukraine. Okay, so then what I want to do now in the next, let's hope it's half an hour. If it's too long, please cut me off. Is to look at the promise, to actually engage with the various aspects of how, and in different subfields of foreign policy, feminist foreign policy can make an addition. And as David said, a special focus will be on security policy at the second section, but I also engaged with the duality of having official guidelines, official policy guidelines by different states, and there are, in fact, arguably a couple of states more than I already mentioned. And secondly, also then the feminist activists and the feminist scholars that have obviously brought about this concept in the first place, and that are in dialogue with one another, but also in conflict with one another over how feminist foreign policy ought to be interpreted and then also implemented. Okay, so why talk about it at all, right? It's a bit of a silly question since you're all here. I'm preaching presumably to the converted, but I think it still makes sense to quickly make the case why it's important, rather than simply being a fad, as many observers initially thought when 9 years ago when Sweden announced that it was shifting to a feminist foreign policy, not a feminist policy overall. And that's, again, because theories of international relations are not just manners of explaining and analytically analyzing the way the world works, and specifically the way international relations and conflict works, but also they are, and they're often taken to be, normative approaches on how international relations are to be conducted and how conflicts are to be resolved. To take the issue of geopolitics, if you think it's a theory, some in the Russian leadership clearly think it's also a prescription on how to deal with other countries. And it's the crucial thing also here is that size matters. So one reason why we're talking about it today, and why there are many of conferences that are dealing with feminist foreign policy, is that it's not just Sweden anymore, right? When Sweden announced it, it was seen as, well, Sweden can do this because it has a long history of engaging domestically, but also internationally, with female causes, with women's empowerment, and striving for a feminist domestic setting as well. But it was seen as something of a niche issue that wouldn't really translate elsewhere. But, and you saw the list already, there are actually now substantial global powers that are officially endorsing feminist foreign policy, and several others that are adjacent to it in the meetings with the feminist foreign policy plus groups. So it's from Chile to Colombia, Canada and Mexico, all in the Americas. You have Liberia and also potentially Tunisia in Africa. You got Spain, France, Germany, Mexico, the Netherlands, maybe, Luxembourg in Europe, but you also have countries like Mongolia in Asia that are quite active in that sense. And even beyond that, as I already mentioned, there are these FFP, Feminist Foreign Policy Plus meetings that engage with countries like Rwanda or Costa Rica or Norway that don't really want to adopt the term Feminist Foreign Policy, but are interested in the very much the same objectives behind it. And the final case I think I want to make why feminist foreign policy is such an attractive and interesting topic to discuss, and maybe being in Turkey is particularly interesting in that, is that it's arguably one of the first theories of international relations that is not specifically developed by and also for representatives of the global north or the leaders of the international arena at the time. So if you look at traditional theories, they all tend to be developed by and largely for and from the perspective of the respective leading countries at the time, which was at the time mostly the West and the Soviet Union, increasingly now also maybe China, you could say, or other parts of the wider West. But in this case, feminist foreign policy is not only critical of the existing order, but it also has many, many different intellectual mothers and then some fathers that are from the global north and from the global south. So it has also quite an attractive nature in that sense. So it doesn't reek of the neo-colonial imposition as some other theories do. Okay then, yeah, David, thanks for already mentioning Annalena Baerbock, and of course I'm also going to quote her, not just because I'm German, but before I get to this, so what actually is feminist foreign policy in principle? What is it? What could it be thought of to be? And the first is, I'll be disappointing you, there is no real one definition, right? There's nothing that everybody agrees on that feminist foreign policy is, should be, or ought to be, consists of. So if you ask somebody says, so what's a feminist foreign policy, say for trade policy, there can't be a single answer. And I think it's important to remember that there also shouldn't be a single answer. So one of the key aspects of feminist foreign policy is, and I think it's the fourth R, and I get to it in a second as well, is that it's reflective, right? It's not just a reality, based on reality checking, its approaches, it's reflective and tries to adapt to circumstances, but it also adapts to changing circumstances, but it also adapts to changing settings, so that it doesn't have a template that you can simply transpose on any issue. So the second thing I think is important, it's okay to have different answers. And I've personally come around to this because a lot of the criticism that has been levied at feminist foreign policy, particularly from people on the conservative side of the political spectrum, is critical because feminist foreign policy doesn't give a specific answer, or rather because different proponents of feminist foreign policy give differing answers. So if you take David's example of how to respond to Iran, feminist activists across Europe were calling for much harsher sanctions or even cutting off or ending the nuclear deal, as opposed to the countries that espouse feminist foreign policy that have been much more lenient and much more relaxed when it came to that. So there's a clear-cut dichotomy here. And I think the important thing we as an audience, but also the proponents of feminist foreign policy, have to be okay with, have to accept that, because it's something that, if you look at more closely at competing theories that have been around for a long time, the same can be said. It's just that if you come across as a new theory, there are much harsher demands made on its consistency and on its clarity. Okay, so, but then the definition now, because I take one, and I'm not taking it just because I'm German, but it's also because it's very recent, and it encapsulates a lot of the things that other countries have also previously, especially Sweden, but also Canada and France, have previously said. So Annalena Baerbock, in the preface to the Feminist Foreign Policy Guidelines, says, and I warn you, it's a long quote, "Feminist foreign policy means that we do not just see particular vulnerabilities, but strategically tackle them, including in our project funding or humanitarian assistance. Feminist foreign policy thus seeks to achieve equality for women and girls worldwide. It attends to the particular concerns of marginalized groups. Feminist foreign policy seeks to achieve a world in which all human beings enjoy the same rights. It seeks to ensure their equal representation in all areas of life. It seeks to pave the way for them to have equal access to resources. It seeks to harness the fact that women as agents of change and in senior positions propel societies forward and strengthen democracy. it seeks to achieve this for all people in equal measure. So that's a lot of it seeks, but it's also highly, highly ambitious and far-reaching definition. But it also tells you, just by its very length, that feminist foreign policy tries to and probably should cover lots of different grounds, but also struggles to be sometimes to be precise. While there are arguably, and I've spoken to quite a lot of activists, also scholars, in preparation of this project, well, there are almost as many definitions as there are activists and scholars. I think one particular addition I found to this definition is quite helpful, and it ties into this fourth R of a reality check. And that's by Claudia Ziller, again, another German-Argentinian researcher from the German SWP, Stiftung Wissenschaftspolitik, government-leaning think tank. And she said that what really sets feminist foreign policy apart is that it is both a value-driven foreign policy. So that seems kind of obvious, right? It's driven by values, by specific ideas, but it's also an evidence-based foreign policy. So the objectives it has, that feminist foreign policy tries to achieve, it does not only because they're the right thing to do, it's not just because women ought to sit on the table, but because, and I think you also alluded to, and David as well, and so did you, Virgo, because it's effective. Because by including women, but also by including marginalized groups especially, you're also helping to achieve your overall objectives. So this is, I think, quite an important thing. And it kind of, I think it's encapsulated by, the Dutch call it the fourth R, the reality check. But yeah, coming back to Baerbock's definition, they were already mentioned, and I only briefly go to it. It's kind of tied to the three R's, if you break it down. Three R's are representation, rights, and resources. And they are, you could say so, I think they're quite clearly copied from Sweden. So you see quite strongly the path dependency that the Swedish case also presents, because the Swedish case, Sweden initially set out these three R's as the cornerstones of its feminist foreign policy, and in similar way, it's come down to Germany and other countries. But crucially, and I think it also speaks out of Baerbock's definition, is that feminist foreign policy is not just about women and girls. It's not just about gender equality and not just about women's empowerment. It has an intersectional perspective. And I think this comes out quite clearly wherever you speak to that. Unless it's an intersectional approach, feminist foreign policy cannot be really feminist. So this kind of sets it apart from gender equality policy, I would say. And the thing is that it focuses clearly on women and girls, but on all marginalized and discriminated groups in other societies. So that's a very radical shift away from the way the objectives and the target groups of foreign policy are being conceived. So it's no longer states and institutions, but it's the marginalized groups in your own country, but also in other countries that are the target group, and that should be addressed. And clearly here you have one of the first major challenges of how to implement this, because we are still living in a state system that predominantly is not feminist, where most of the countries do not abide by a feminist ideology, and that also, where many countries still think that the state should have priority in international relations. So interstate relations should be based on state-to-state relations as opposed to a state interfering in another state's internal affairs. Helping the marginalized groups, the marginalized women in any country, Mali, for instance. Okay. And the final thing I would also add, and this is the fifth R I would add, that's quite characteristic of feminist approaches. And now this is the fifth R that is not necessarily represented in official guidelines, but is a key component of feminist activism. And that is that feminist foreign policy has to be radical. And here it's where it gets tricky sometimes, because it's radical in that it calls for a radical transformation of societies. And radical transformation of societies first internally, but also radical transformation of power relations internationally. So it really doesn't want the international system to stay the same, but shift the focus and the strength to the disadvantaged. And what this often means, and I think this is sometimes less spelled out, is that some sides are going to lose out in this. For instance, some states will have to, take back something of their trade surplus. It may mean that countries are are paying back for past misdeeds. So, for instance, when it comes to Germany, Germany is much less keen to relinquish its role as the international champion, or the export champion of the world, in order to have more equitable international trade agreements that are supporting marginalized groups, as opposed to when it comes to supporting, say, local women's projects in the global south. And there's also something here that's quite paradoxical. I think it's quite the paradox of feminist foreign policy, in that it's fundamentally a grassroots movement that's critical of power relations, that's critical of the status quo, but it is being implemented sometimes in a top-down manner by states that are adopting this. And so it's being implemented, and you can say it's quite clear in the German case, it's implemented because of a political decision to have a feminist foreign policy, which you're now imposing on bureaucrats, on state officials, on institutions that are often reluctant or not necessarily convinced that this is the right thing to do. So you have a very, very, very odd situation in having a power critical theory that addresses power from the top down. So the point is that some, and I don't think it's the majority, but some feminist criticism of feminist foreign policy as it exists today goes to the fact that you can't have feminist foreign policy the way it's being done right now. Because by using the state and using its mechanisms of power and domination, you are basically invalidating the very feminist project. So this is one thing that I think that it's not easy to push aside. However, I'm just going to push it aside for now and leave it for discussion maybe later on. Because when you look at the very brief history of feminist foreign policy that we're looking, not even a decade, clearly it is possible to have some sort of thing that you call feminist foreign policy. Many people do. You always have the duality, as I mentioned earlier, of activists, thinkers, scholars, and then the official guidelines. But maybe that's not so much of a duality. But what's clear, however, and we talked about this in preparation for this, Birgül Hoca, is that obviously there's a long history of feminist critique of international relations that precedes 2014, right? Antigone is just a famous one. Cynthia Enlows, I think, is very, very influential in that sense, in that they're developing a critique of why there aren't many men, why there are only men standing here on this podium right now, for instance. But another thing that's less discussed, and then the scholarly criticism, is another precursor, and I think that's the much maligned United Nations, the United Nations bodies, because Margot Wallström, the initial Minister of Foreign Affairs that kickstarted Swedish foreign policy, previously worked in the UN bodies. And I think that if you look at some of the key initial figures that supported feminist foreign policy, many of them originated from the United Nations bodies. And that's no coincidence, because many of the ideas, if you look at them specifically when it comes to development cooperation, I'll get to that in a second, have a strong overlap with what the UNDP has been preaching basically since the late 1990s. So more concern for local actors, more concern for eye level, more structural funding, a shift in the way the international arena is being conceived. So all these things have been tried to some extent in this kind of benign universe, sometimes benign universe of the United Nations and its sub-institutions. And many of them then subsequently transitioned to feminist foreign policy positions in some extent. But then I already said that there's this dualism of activists and thinkers and governments, but that's in this case actually not very much the case, because the lines tend to be very blurred, because just like you said, David, you're yourself previously a human rights activist, many of the activists, feminist activists later then, using the language of the 1960s, made the long march through the institutions, and in fact, through electoral success, through appointments into positions, in fact, and joined the governments. So they joined the institutions they initially criticized. That's the first level, through which feminist activism, in fact, blurred the lines. And then secondly, in formulating the guidelines that many of the countries have had, there's been a continuous discussion and input from the activists and from the feminist scholars on the guidelines. And to take the example of Germany, because it's the most recent one, it said 2021 for the feminist foreign policy. That's not really the case. It was just that we want to have a feminist foreign policy. But then what actually happened is the Foreign Office, and particularly the Foreign Office, but also the Ministry of Development Cooperation, called on feminist activists to bring in their ideas. They had a lot of meeting. They had even like it's funny to think of from an academic perspective, they had call for papers. But when you have a call for paper, it's for a special issue, it's for an edited volume. But here it was a call for paper for ideas for the feminist foreign policy. And this is not just, let's use the German form, pro forma. It's not just on the surface of it, because when I spoke to some people who submitted submitted essays, submitted ideas, went to these meetings, they actually found these ideas later on in the official guidelines that were published this year. So there's clear input from the civil society side that comes out on the other side. The Netherlands, until recently at least, were doing very much the same thing. Who knows what's happened after the elections. In other countries, for instance, France, have regular consultations where they come together in an institutionalized format with civil society organizations from a feminist camp and then discuss how things are going. And according to those are not particularly amicable. So it's not just everyone's really happy with things. Okay. But then what you have, and I said initially that there's been some copy and pasting when it comes to the strategies, you still have very different, you kind of have a unity and diversity approach when you look at how the various countries approach feminist policy, understand feminist foreign policy. So to be very shallow in this overview for sake of time. So the Netherlands, for instance, focuses a lot on global South leadership when it comes to development cooperation. Sweden was trying to have a very broad approach across all spectrum. France and Canada, also some of the initial adopters, emphasize the focus on empowering women in development cooperation, but not in other fields. So it's clear focus on just development cooperation. For Colombia, it's the importance on sustainable peace building. Mexico wants to fight against femicides. Chile values social justice. They all do other things as well, but this is kind of there are different emphases they all have. And some other countries like Liberia and Mongolia that haven't even published their ideas yet are certain to have very different approaches, simply because they come from different grievances in different areas. But I also want to take a case like Libya that was mentioned up here as a sign that, coming back to why feminist foreign policy is has become such an influential theory. Because Libya only made an announcement. There was just one announcement that by the foreign minister, who happens to be the first female foreign minister in Libya, who said that we're going to have a feminist foreign policy. And then afterwards, as far as I can tell, the people I've spoken to, nothing ever happened again. And so you might say, and people have been saying that it's just a case of nation branding, right? You're making an announcement because it's kind of sexy or attractive, makes this country sound more progressive. But even that, you can say, is a huge success, because it's very hard to think, even going back 10 years, that the country would, especially now in the North Africa, would say, we want to have a feminist foreign policy and use that as something to gain weight either domestically against potential internal opponents or internationally, the international scene. So that's, I would say, even a big step forward. And the other thing about the unity and diversity is that while there are differences, there's a lot of cooperation and coordination happening now. Because, as you know, we're not living in a feminist world, so there's been a concerted effort by the countries to actually come together and coordinate what they're trying to achieve and how they conceive of a feminist foreign policy. So maybe it's not so much plagiarism, but it's actually inspiration, why some of the wording is almost verbatim the same between, say, Sweden, France, Germany, and Spain. And so there are also now regular conferences, for instance, in Berlin last year, in The Hague just a month ago, and in Mexico next year. So there's some institutionalized framework already. So I'll just have a quick sip. What do you mean in practice? There's been a lot of talking now in principle. What does it mean in practice? Now it gets dicier still. So how are those 3 R's, at least the 3 R's, translated into actual policy? One thing is, if you look at the first R, representation. Representation can mean, for instance, hiring practice, right? You use affirmative action to have more women in positions. And that's been happening across the board, really. So you have, for instance, in Germany, more diplomats are being hired now that are women, just even if they're on the same level, same qualification, then women are chosen. You can have, when you look at the resources, this can be reflected, for instance, in gender budgeting, so that all development projects have to undergo gender budgeting. This has been happening for some time in other countries, but this is something that is clearly a clear embodiment. And when it comes to rights, you tend to have training, first of all, for all staff and all members. But you also have to have a forced discussion about how policy is going to impact women and other marginalized groups prior to enacting any policy. So something that slowly has to take root. But crucially, what all this really matters is it shouldn't just be about men. It shouldn't just be about women. It always has to involve men as well. So men, as members of diplomatic staff, members of agencies, have to be included, have to be trained, have to be aware of their position as generally advantaged position, but also as potential allies in trying to further feminist agendas. So what Germany, for instance, is doing is having focal points in each embassy, because it's shown itself to be very difficult to get feminist thinking across to 20 diplomats who are often sometimes reluctant to engage with it. They have to have a focal point in every embassy that keeps reminding them, and instead of having just a one-off training in gender equality or gender awareness, they keep having those regular meetings and regular trainings. And so the area where feminist foreign policy has the clearest application has been development cooperation. And as I said earlier, when it comes to the UNDP and other development agencies, this is not really that's not really surprising, given that much of the calls that feminist foreign policy does in development cooperation are very much what's already been happening for the last 20 years as the gold standard of good practice of development cooperation. And that is engage more with local stakeholders, listen to their demands, engage with all marginalized groups, have eye-to-eye level discussions over funding, fund networks instead of just do project funding, and those kind of things. Another example, though, can be trade. And here it already becomes more complicated. So you have, for instance, trade delegations. Used to be only, well, the champions of industry, leading banks used to come along on a meeting in New York or elsewhere. But now, in the feminist setting, you also have humanitarian actors. You also have representatives of human rights groups, of, trade unions that are also accompanying the delegations. It's all on a very simple level. And another further area that I really, unfortunately, don't know very little about is climate change resilience, which kind of ties into with development cooperation, because women and girls tend to be the ones that are most affected by climate change, especially in the global south. But when you look at the 3 R's, one thing that kind of sticks out is that the first R tends to be prioritized over the others. So representation is the one that is most easily done, and it also kind of seems to be like the first thing that's achievable, because also it tends to happen domestically. It's done in a domestic setting, right? You hire more people, you bring people to delegation. It doesn't mean having awkward and unpleasant conversations with people in other countries that may disagree with you. The other area where I think, though, where you still also have quite substantial progress is gender budgeting, so that you have, in fact, in many countries, even an awareness where kind of projects primarily target women's empowerment and women's issues, and which at least tangentially touch upon them. For instance, in Germany, this wasn't the case. Even in Norway, and I spoke to you there, they've only recently come across like actually developing statistics on this, which may seem a bit dull, but having a kind of a knowledge base is really the basis for making advances in that field. But this also ties into another thing, which is that feminist foreign policy requires, first and foremost, domestic reforms. Because if you're trying to, which kind of shows you why feminist foreign policy may not be for everyone, it may not be for every state, for every political party, for every political leaning. Because in order to convey convincingly that you are pursuing feminist goals abroad, you kind of also have to show that you're pursuing the same policies domestically. You're making an effort to become more gender aware, you're helping marginalized groups in your country yourself. And so this kind of leads on to what I think is one of the core challenges of feminist foreign policy, and that is not one of the R's, but it's the F. It's the first F, and that's the feminist F. So one thing that's been repeated quite a lot as something that, for instance, in the German case, but also in, say, the French case I heard, is do we really need the term feminist foreign policy. And I think in our first meeting with you, David, he says, do we really need this, right? And the thing is, I think it's an open question. And that's an open question that's still being discussed, and that every country and every institution answered it differently. Because you could have the same policies in development cooperation, you had the same policies without the label. You could call it inclusive foreign policy or human rights-based foreign policy. Why do you need this label? Why? Why irritate people? Because that's the other thing, as I already mentioned, feminist foreign policy is radical. It's a radical movement, and radical change tends to be something that is really hard to implement, hard to enforce upon institutions that do not really like, but tend to prefer incremental change to radical transformations. Because first of all, when you're working in foreign policy, you tend to work with countries, partners that may just be completely alien to the idea of feminism, or that effectively are opposed to the idea of feminism. So then using the framing of doing a policy, say helping disenfranchised women in northern Uganda, doing it under the label of feminist foreign policy may actually cause much more pushback than doing it under the label of rural women's empowerment or rural renovation or pro-poor development. So this is something that, for instance, a country like Norway has deliberately chosen to stay away from this. So they've never, even though they're one of the front runners and they've always been in terms of spending and also policies, they've never used the term feminist foreign policy and don't want to, even though they engage in meetings. And the second thing, part of this, is obviously on the domestic side, because we're here in a meeting, right, partly co-organized by the Böll Foundation. It's feminist foreign policy is very much tied to progressive political parties. And as such, other parties tend to dislike it for the very fact that it is tied to progressive causes and are almost allergic to the term. So if you look at the Swedish case, clearly it's a right-wing and it's a far right-wing party that won the elections, and they were not necessarily opposed to the policy content, but to the term. They didn't want to be termed feminist. Because when you look at the policies that Sweden is pursuing, in security policy, but also in development policy, nothing has changed. Literally, there hasn't been any substantial change in policy, except for the change in the term. However, and you can speak and say that maybe the Netherlands will undergo the same development now after last week's election results. However, obviously that's not a general truth, right? In some cases, if you have a different election result, then you have a complete shift in policy. So Argentina, while it hasn't had a feminist foreign policy, it was a member of this Feminist Foreign Policy Plus group, one of the few South American countries. And clearly after Javier Milei won the elections on an anti-feminist platform, among other things, it's unlikely that their policies are not going to change. So there's real risk to the institutionalization of feminist foreign policy. It may, in fact, in the case of Sweden, it may stay in real policy, but it may also completely shift course because of the term and because of its problematic nature. However, and this is just my intervention on this. You're very welcome to disagree with this. I think that actually that the radical ambition of the term, the radical ambition of feminist foreign policy as a term, is really the only reason why we're not the only reason, but is one of the reasons why it is becomes such a big issue. And while it may increase the level of vilification and hatred and pushback it gets from conservative circles, even well-funded conservative circles, it is in fact one of the reasons why some gradual changes are being implemented and why more and more countries are leaning towards it. So by setting it into a polar opposition, you in fact increase the attractiveness of the option. And so I think in this case, taking heat from the women's movement for a long time is quite helpful, because by gradually asking for gradual improvements, you've hardly ever gotten anywhere, right? It's typically by asking for much that you tend to get somewhere in the end, not by politely demanding. And so now I finally get to the one area where this politely asking is certainly not going to get anywhere, and that is security policy, which is both kind of the most interesting, but also the weakest, I would say, the most feebly developed part of feminist foreign policy, to date at least. So how does feminist policy account for and explain and address international conflicts? Because initially, when Sweden declared, it was thought that the reason why this was accepted and wasn't really much ridiculed is because Sweden was seen as a soft power, right? It's a country that has traditionally not engaged in military conflict. It has been, it's a major arms exporter, that's something else, but it has been very keen on portraying itself as benevolent and engaging with civil society and not doing anything harmful. Obviously, only recently trying to join NATO. But then this is no longer the case also with the countries that are now following feminist foreign policy. Germany, France, Canada, and others are also engaged in violent conflicts across the world. So what are solutions of translating this? So there's one is a simpler way, and that's kind of shirking the question. And that's by saying that you have to reconfigure, as Jackie True did in her Continuum of Peace, feminist criticism of peace studies, that you have to conceive of domestic situation as part of the security dimension, right? So if you, by doing feminist policies domestically, you are in fact decreasing the level of violence experienced by women and girls in your country. Anything from discrimination in education to female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and so on. And thus, you're directly contributing to more security. That's the domestic element. The second is actually further reaching in its international dimension, which is the claim that countries that are, that's been studied, although it's a bit of a controversial if it really holds statistically, that countries that are more gender unequal and more, have more masculine, militaristic masculinities in their domestic setting tend to be more aggressive internationally. So they're more prone to act aggressively against neighboring countries, to attack and to assault. So that's the other argument, but I think it's not a particularly strong one. So the argument would be then, by fighting patriarchy domestically, you're also contributing to world peace. So this is kind of the argument that's been made. But that still doesn't touch upon things like, what's a feminist response to a looming conflict or to an ongoing violent conflict? How does that come into play? And here, this translation is much more difficult, and it's difficult for a number of reasons. And the first is the large overlap of, both in terms of personnel, but also ideological leanings of much of the second generation feminist movement and the pacifist movement. So many of the ideas of, when it comes to security policy, are based on a pacifist understanding of the international arena. Based again on the analysis of the feminist critique of international relations, that much of war, much of conflict is due to militarized masculinities, to the male attempt to dominate rather than seeking peaceful mediation, the attempt to enforce a male order and to kind of reward violence domestically and internationally. But then this is kind of, and the embodiment of this is when you look at one of the core contributors on the civil society field into the German case, again, the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, here has a clear disconnect to the official guidelines, because they, prior to the guidelines being published, in fact called for the abolition of the Ministry of Defense, because it was seen as part of the military-industrial complex that was in fact contributing to violence instead of. And so you have a strong pacifist side to the feminist activism, but you also have this discrepancy between different countries here. So there's lots of disunity and diversity. Whereas, say, the German feminist foreign policy guidelines explicitly state that this is not a pacifist agenda. We are not trying to have a pacifist approach to international relations. So we're willing to use violent force, willing to send soldiers, willing to send arms elsewhere. Other countries do very differently. So it's only the draft agenda for Colombia, but they have a concept called paz total, absolute peace, and which is that this is clearly a pacifist agenda. We are not going to engage with any violence to resolve or to prevent international conflicts. So here we have also quite a lot of disunity among the states, even on the state level, that are engaging with it. Okay. And the problem here is also not, as I mentioned with the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy and others, is that in this case, in the case of security policy, there's, in contrast to other fields of development, where many of the practitioners are already feminist leaning or in favor of feminist goals, that in fact in the security field, you still tend to have, in most countries, it doesn't really matter which world region, they tend to be male-dominated, and they tend to be partly self-recruited from the security sector, so from the army, from the police, from adjacent think tanks, and thus come also from a mindset that is not keen on feminist approaches to settling violent conflicts. Okay. Well, was that? Too many pages, man. And the problem here is also that when you look at the actual guidelines, that there are, they don't tend to be very instructive when it comes to security policy. So there's very limited meat to the bone here. The one thing that's always mentioned at university is support for the Women, Peace and Security agenda by the United Nations, Resolution 1325. It's been around since 2000. But what it really translates to then in policy prescriptions is to have more women in peace building. So in post-conflict peace building, you should have more women included because this tends to be more, leads to better outcomes and leads to be more equitable solutions. And that's a very important step, but this tends to be very much the extent to which this is covered. And the other problem is also that it's an after-the-fact policy as opposed to the preventive side. So why is it so hard to translate feminist foreign policy to security policy? The first thing I think is governance architecture, right? You have a lot of competition between different ministries, different cabinet posts. And here something comes into play that I haven't mentioned yet, is that feminist foreign policy is oftentimes not engaged by the entire state, but by specific ministries. So Germany doesn't have a feminist foreign policy for its entire government portfolio, but it's the feminist foreign policy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Development Cooperation, but not of the Ministry of Defense. So you have this competition. And you also have, say, the Ministry of Defense having a different agenda, a different strategy. And this again would be, Germany is a great case, where you have the same year that the feminist foreign policy guidelines were published, Germany had its first post-war national security agenda, which was supposed to be integrated with the feminist approach, but they eventually couldn't agree on the same terms. So if you read the national security agenda now, they have a very different approach to settling conflicts. So it's still based on strengthening the army, identifying key opponent challenges, trying to find multilateral alliances against potential conflicts. And then at the end of each section, there's a short mention of feminist foreign policy also being a consideration. But you can't get away from the fact that it seems very much like tokenism. So it's just mentioned for the sake of it. So another, and I mentioned this earlier, another structural reason is of enforcing feminist foreign policy and security are strong persuasions among key actors, not just obviously among political class, but also among scholars on how international relations works. And I'm now coming back to the start of it, right? So if we imagine that Ukraine ought to try, as some feminist activists say, ought to try a more peaceful, more pacifist approach to dealing with Russia, then how is this going to be taken up by the opposing side, by the Russian leadership, that doesn't believe in feminist foreign policy, but does believe in a zero-sum game of international relations, where you have to build upon the opponent's weaknesses to strengthen your own standing. So that's a structural problem that is really hard to overcome unless we have a feminist international of some size, which we're still far away from. Okay, so now, and I'm coming to the end, I promise. The final thing is I'm trying to, while I am typically a scholar, I also back in the day used to work at a think tank. And one thing that always stuck was important there was not just the so what, so why we're talking about this, and I hope I've made this somewhat clear now, but also the now what. So what do we do now with all of this? So what is to be done? So what I'll try to do now in the last section is just present some, not just a critique, but also put out some ideas of what a feminist security policy could and potentially should look like. And this is obviously not a definitive proposal, but something like an invitation for discussion. So the first thing I think is to emphasize, and I'm grateful to my former colleague Serafine Dinkel, used to be at the University of St. Gallen in Brussels, for this concept, is that you have human security plus right? So you have human security. This has been a long time concept, or again originating kind of from the development community, that you focus instead of on state security, on institution security, on the actual people, on groups of people. And so the plus side of here would be two things, right? You have an intersectional human security approach, in the sense that you realize that rather than that all members of say an area or community are equally affected by security crises. Say in Mali, a single widowed mother is much differently affected than a rich, powerful man, even if they belong to the same area or the same community. So that's one thing. You're trying to adapt your policy to the different local groups. The second thing is, I think, quite important again, that you have a reflexive approach, in that when you're trying to improve security for local groups, you're again looking at what works and what doesn't, quite a specific thing. And again, in the same sense, you're crisis specific. You're not just trying to impose a generalized. Or third tool, and I promise to hurry up now, which I think is quite crucial, is to have a preventative side to feminist foreign policy in the security field. So not just act after the fact, as with the peace building side, but try to prevent conflict in the first place. And to do this without actual military force, the one area where I think a lot can be done is by focusing on justice and accountability. So the area where by credibly enforcing, by credibly setting a deterrent to potential perpetrators, that they are going to be tried either in a national tribunal or at the International Criminal Court or in a special hybrid court. If you're setting this out right from the start, if you're helping collect the evidence, has been happening in, say, Syria or in Ukraine, where Germany has been sending, for instance, rape kits to document cases of sexual aggression, then this can help set the precedent for future cases where perpetrators may think twice if they are aware that they may be caught and they may actually face retributions for their actions. So I think this is something that the feminist foreign policy should be investing a lot more in. Okay. Final thing is just to look at some what I would think could be best cases, and kind of looking at Ukraine here. When you look at Ukraine, the overall perception of the war tends to be of two armies fighting in almost like a First World War type of setting. But what's actually the case is also that Russia in particular has been using sexualized violence as a deliberate ploy. And so one thing, for instance, that feminist foreign policy should be doing is putting internationally, but also nationally, putting this in the spotlight again, making clear that this is what's actually happening. This is a particular strategy of war that has to be condemned in addition to the overall aggression of war. And it has to be documented. And here I think, like sending out rape kits may be something simple, but documenting the violence that's being happening is the first step to accountability. Similarly, it doesn't, coming back to the fact that men also cannot have to be engaged in the security sector, it's really important, for instance, in the case of Ukraine, sticking with it, not just to think of the Russians, but also think of the many, probably millions now traumatized, mostly male soldiers that are returning home and that are, in fact, oftentimes a threat also to act out their traumatization against the women or their children. So this could also be an action of trying to prevent domestic violence rising dramatically in the aftermath of war, which we generally tend to see. This could be an area where feminist foreign policy could jump in, trying to retrain, trying to help with psychosocial care, but also trying to have preventative training in fighting militarized masculinities. And finally, and that's the final thing, money matters. I think funding has to be really crucial. And it has to be crucial in the sense that not just money shouldn't just be there for development projects, but it should also be there for especially localized networks of actors. And I'm quite leaning here on a recent study by, again, a German think tank, the GPPI, German Public Policy Institute, that analyzed peace-building initiatives that had a feminist tension. And one thing that generally worked out best was to have, and this is a general call, to have institutionalized long-term funding, to give away decision-making power to the local actors, provided you can trust them, and then invest in networks. because localized networks tend to be much better equipped to deal with local crises than outside actors. And this is important. Funding is also important because, I think I said this in the beginning sometime, there's a lot of money now on the table for feminist actors, but there's a lot more money going against it. So I was at this recent conference in The Hague and on feminist foreign policy, and one of the most chilling workshops I attended was on the structural cooperation and immense funding that anti-feminist actors are receiving, particularly in the US, but also globally now. So whereas most people that are engaging in progressive causes, and feminism is obviously one of them, tend to focus on internecine struggle to fight with one another over things. This tends to be not so much the case surprisingly enough, on the anti-feminist camp, where there's a lot of coordination and a lot of money being poured into the struggle to keep feminist foreign policy down. Having said this, I think it's in a way a great sign that feminist foreign policy gets so much funding against it, because it shows that it has the potential to actually make a change. Thank you very much. That was a bit long, but thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive and insightful speech. I don't want to summarize your seminar, but I just want to emphasize a few points. I think it is important that you mentioned some paradoxes with regard to a feminist foreign policy. On the one hand, it's a kind of grassroots movement, but on the other hand, when a country adopts it officially, then it becomes top-down, and it is an important paradox. And it is also important that, when we think about feminist foreign policy, both its definition, both on the theoretical level, but at the practical level, there are varieties of feminist foreign policy. It is not just one definition, and it is not just one implementation as well. And I also find it quite interesting that you expanded our horizon, so to say, when you mentioned in the last part of your presentation how we can implement feminist foreign policy in the security field, and you have provided lots of food for thought, and I am sure you have many questions and feedbacks and comments, and I would like to open the Q&A session. You are more than welcome to ask your questions and to make your comments to Dr. Frahm. Please.
Thank you for your speech, first and foremost. I was going to ask, which CDG goals are you working with, apart from, I assume, the 5th one, which is gender equality, and 10th one, I think, which is reduce inequalities. Is there anything specific that you are working with?
It's working, right? Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. I think, obviously, I'm not a practitioner of feminist foreign policy, but the thing is that, and I hope that this came out, that many more of the SDGs are actually relevant for this, right? Climate change would be one. Don't remember the exact number, but obviously there's one about, I think it's number 16, about preventing violence, preventing peace. So I think there's a large overlap in general between the Sustainable Development Goals and feminist foreign policy. And then, so they're almost working in parallel or overlapping to a large extent. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Other questions?
First of all, thank you for your speech, and I think I understood a lot of your notions in feminist foreign policy. And my main question is that how do you relate feminist foreign policy and fragile masculinity in international level of politics? Do you think it is the main significance that stands against feminist foreign policy in domestic level? Because you also mentioned that there's a substance of domestic level of obstacle.
Sorry, I kind of missed. What kind of masculinities were you talking about? Fragile masculinities?
Yes, fragile
yeah, okay.
masculinity.
So I think that, thank you very much for that question. I think that's, I probably didn't accentuate it enough. I think that's one of the key aspects where feminist foreign policy can really make the leap, sort of, so to speak, to becoming more broadly acceptable. Also because it has to engage men to some extent, but it has to engage them in a way that it's not on men's terms, if you can say that, but kind of getting men to engage with feminist ideas, but making them their own. And I think that's a precondition for all countries. So it doesn't apply to just conflict-ridden countries, but to any country of the global north or wherever. And so I can just point out one organization that I found it's one of the largest ones that I found very helpful in this sense. It's called Men Engage, and they organize workshops all the world over and on trying to help men, particularly younger men and boys, to engage with their own preconceptions of how to act in a conflict, how to deal with an issue. And oftentimes then it comes out that they have all these ideas of honor, but it is really cross-culturally an issue. And then they're trying to, and not just, again, not in a one-off thing, but in continuous meetings, trying to work on this. And interestingly, they're not only doing this with, say, local disadvantaged groups, but they're also doing it, for example, with government officials. So in one of the ministries, I'm not going to say which one, that was present there, said that they are engaging this organization to train their staff, because when they disorganize one of those gender trainings, nobody shows up, or they just smirk a bit and then walk away. So I think there's a huge potential there.
Thank you so much. Other questions? Yeah, please. You need to wait for the microphone. Just a second, please. Ama kayıt alındığı için o yüzden mikrofonu özellikle gerek.
It's not the very other edge.
Okay, so you have said that there are different versions and approaches of feminism that run from the global north to global south. So in that case, how would you evaluate the feminist movements and feminist foreign policy in Turkey?
Thank you for a most challenging question. So I think it's not upon me to evaluate it says, but then I can give some observations, right? It's very different, obviously, working in a setting where you're not supported by the state, or where there's a strong dissonance between official pronouncements on gender equality, or the disbelief in gender equality. What I found quite interesting is that you have kind of a bifurcated movement, that you have some organizations that are almost aligning with government policy, partly to get funding, also to get support, and then you have just fundamental opposition that is fundamental opposition just because they have no other access to it. So I think that's the split is quite interesting. But I think that should be. I'd kind of like to put the question back to you, because I mean, how do you perceive it's also a difference maybe to other feminist movements?
Yeah, so for me, it's a complex thing because most of the people in Turkey sees that, maybe all around the world. I'm not sure about that, but especially we are not an Islamic state, but we are a republic state who has majority and Muslim. So most of the people see that feminism against to Islam, or women's rights is against to Islamic rules. So I believe that most of the people have wrong perceptions about what is feminism really is in Turkey. So, for example, I have my boyfriends that I have been, discuss what is feminism really is, and they don't respect the populist feminist ideas, but they also respect apart from the Islamism or apart from the culture, apart from anything else, they respect women like fundamentally, but they refuse the populist feminist ideas like women more superior than men.
I don't accept that. They say that, but the feminism is in the foundation is not saying that actually. Like like you said that feminism is not related with women and girls, but it should be related with all the excluded groups in the societies or the target groups. But they don't see that maybe because of the false consciousness of maleness or masculinity, like not maleness, masculinity. They see that supporting the woman is reduce their masculinity or reduce their men's rights, not as a citizen, but as a man in the patriarchal society as Turkey.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better. Yeah, I think that though it's also important that I think that doesn't just go for Turkey, but it goes for other countries as well, that this intersectional understanding of feminism. I mean, while it's clearly prevalent among the feminist scene itself, it's not that well received in the public. So it's still seen as this antagonism between men and women, as opposed to the opportunity also that's presented to men to let go of certain, say, adamol, and some preconceived notions of what it means to be a man and how you have to behave. Yeah.
You mentioned Islam, but I think that it's not about Islamic issue, because there is one group, Islamic feminists, and generally men also resist Islamic feminist groups' arguments. So it seems that it's not Islam, it's not tradition, it's about structure, masculine structure. So that's the thing I would like to underline the issue.
Thank you so much. Maybe I just want to add one point about it. As Zehra Hocam mentioned, it is not just tradition or religion, it is about the structure, it is the structure of power. Because if you emphasize masculinity, if you emphasize that, women and men are not equal, but they are complementary, and if you consistently imply that men are superior than women, then it means that you just tend to maintain your power structure. I mean, whenever... I do not say anything about religion. I am just referring to the discourse of politicians. When they say that, we don't accept feminism, women and men, how can they be equals? Or they are complementary to each other. It is related to the structure, and that structure is based on power. When you say that as a male politician, you emphasize your power. And you want to maintain your power, you don't want to share your power with the females or other excluded groups. That's why I think that idea of women and men are not equal, it is really based on, this structure of power. Now I would like to give the microphone to Dr. David.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that actually, the last 10 minutes, I think, were a good example of what you said about feminist foreign policy. First of all, needs to be realized, or its principles have to be realized and at least discussed, but also implemented domestically, right? So, it was very interesting for me to say how quickly we came to gender relations, be they related to religion or not, in Turkey. Now, I wouldn't let you go again without responding to this question about the implementability of feminist foreign policy in Turkey. And if you don't want to refer to the feminist, then take it, as we were discussing earlier, as a value-based or rights-based, non-militaristic foreign policy. And I'm asking this also contesting a little bit when you say your assumption that geopolitics is an older, outdated theory. I, to the contrary, I see geopolitics much on the rise. Definitely the current government in Turkey is totally driven by geopolitical norms and objectives.
foreign policy in Turkey is a geopolitically driven foreign policy, but also in Europe, in Central Western Europe, where we had this consensus about not having war again after the Second World War. I see now that the whole discourse in society and in politics, and not only in foreign politics, is preparing our societies again to consider warfare as a normal element of politics. And I'm very much worried about that. So I also see geopolitics on the rise, even in Western Europe, which perhaps would have been the last region where you would think that geopolitics should have a say. So in that context, first, so I have two questions. How do you see that? Is geopolitics really an overcome theory, which I would say it is not, on the contrary? And then, yeah, what can we do? Where could these students start working to give principles of a feminist foreign policy, rights-based foreign policy, whatever, give this a possibility, give it a space, give it a start? Thank you.
Thank you, David, for those highly challenging questions or comments. So maybe start with the geopolitics first. I think maybe I mispronounced. Outdated was a value judgment I made about the theory, because it's not. I don't think it's a theory that can explain interstate behavior, but it's a normative theory of how state leaders think they should act. Right. So it's what they want. And here, I think it's mostly prevalent in some countries. Say in Russia, in other. I wouldn't say in European countries geopolitics as such is prevalent. However, what happens is, and I think I very much concur with your second point, that we are in fact because of the war in Ukraine, because nothing else really seemed close to Western European hearts and minds. We are again preparing for the possibility to fight war. However, I would kind of counter your point. I think it's become quite clear that, contrary to what maybe some people might be saying, the majority of people Western European publics are not willing to risk their lives or put their lives on the line to fight for their country. And this is quite a big shift when you look at the last 70 years, or even going back to the Cold War period. I think there's a much less willingness to stand up and potentially fight for your country. So there's been a mentality shift that I think is not in line with those appeals by Western European governments. That would be my counter to that, at least. And secondly, how could Turkish feminist foreign policy be implemented? I think obviously the first thing that's on Turks. That's on the Turkish side. I am not one of them, although I live here. I think the first step clearly is it can't be top down, because the current government, but also I don't think an opposition government would be really much in favor of such an approach. From what I gathered during the election campaign, it's not like the opposition was very much in favor of a non-geopolitical foreign policy. What I think can be done has to be grassroots based. It has to be grassroots level contacts with, say, members of neighboring countries. That's one of the simplest, lowest level steps. It could be re-establishing the long-lasting dialogue with Greece, with Georgia, and possibly even Armenia in the current situation, where Armenia has lost all the war. Maybe there's an interest on having ground level, basic grassroots level discussions on this sense, on how societies can overcome their long history of enmity. So I think this would be one thing. And clearly another area, and I mentioned this earlier, was I had like a short racist experience today on the train with some Arab travelers. Maybe deal with the fact that there are so many migrants and not officially refugees with a weird status in Turkey, and see that as part of your engagement also with how to deal with neighboring countries, but also with foreign policy. So the unresolved issue of the vast number of mostly Syrian refugees, I think, is also a question of foreign policy where feminist foreign policy could provide a new answer to what has become a very ugly and heated and public debate, I would say.
so much.
So question?
One point about it. I think in the Turkish context, we also need to pay attention to what municipalities, what cities are doing, because some municipalities are much more progressive with regard to, actions for gender equality compared to the government. Therefore, when you travel, for example, with metro in Ankara, you see, many announcements of the municipality against violence against women, and many announcements of the municipality for gender equality in public transportation in Istanbul as well, for example. That is, what is happening at the local level, at the municipality level, is quite important. And with regard to, a kind of a more inclusive or pacifist foreign policy or foreign relations, again, cities might be a good address to look at. I am also working on city diplomacy, and some of the municipalities have different kind of external relations compared to the official Turkish foreign policy. And it might be an interesting point. Yeah, please
Yes.
go ahead.
Thank you. This is an interesting topic about the feminist foreign policy. And you mentioned toward the end of your speech that there are a lot of money going for helping on advance the agenda, feminist agenda around the world. And to mention some numbers, I read recently that $2.6 billion has been dedicated by the US government for gender equality policies. And the main recipient of this money is from Pakistan, because there is something going on right now in Pakistan. If you want to get money, you can just create a society or association, and you can get money from the US for feminist let's say, policies or feminist actions. And I think there are some politicians out there and people from the public who see this as a form of Western hegemony, again, repeating, because they think that this type of kind of like influencing the countries and dictating some kind of policy to them could be seen as a sort of a moral, they're showing moral superiority over the others. And it could be seen as like a Trojan horse to try to get in and maybe affect, for example, these countries, for example, who refuse Western, or feminist generally, who refuse feminist policies like Russia and China. They see that these feminist policies have caused, that's what they say, I'm not speaking their tongue, but they say that these policies have caused low birth rate, high divorce rate, marriage has been totally, like dwindling. And they say that, no, we want to keep on our tradition values because that's what's work. That has been working for millennia. And feminist policies are just been tested for 50 or 60 years ago. And we see that they're not so efficient on that. So what do you say about these kind of accusations, let's say?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's interesting that it took quite a while for this to come up. So maybe first things first, I think it's interesting that Russia probably wouldn't be making this argument since they have one of the lowest birth rates to begin with. But I'm not aware, I wasn't aware of this special fund designated to Pakistan, but it's quite a change of setting because Pakistan is traditionally the third largest recipient of US military aid, but it's quite a change. But the overall argument, to get really to your point, that's an argument obviously that has been made already, and particularly also by African organizations or states, that there's a threat of a neo-colonial imposition through the back door, sort of the kind of a reinvention of the liberal interventionism. I think there's a clear counter to this, and that's also in the way you actually do projects, or you do funding, in that you, and I hope this came out in my presentation, in that you don't set the terms yourself as say in this case the US, but you're allowing the project to be led and the objectives to be set by the local organization. So in this case, the Pakistani organization. So this would be one counter to this. But obviously, there's always, if you have a society, or in this case also a government, that is not very much in favor of feminist goals, then this is going to be seen as an intervention, and it might be, it might cause trouble in the bilateral relations.
maybe I can abuse my role as moderator and I can ask a question. You have mentioned a lot about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and how the feminist foreign policy can be implemented in that case. Maybe you also would like to reflect on what is happening between Israel and Hamas and how a feminist foreign policy towards that conflict should look like.
I like the way the discussion is going. It's getting harder and harder to respond, and I think this is clearly one of the trickiest issues. Also tricky, not just tricky because I'm German and maybe have a different perspective sometimes on, given the German collective guilt or responsibility that we still feel certainly towards Israel. I think the first thing is clear that one thing then that feminist foreign policy and feminist activists should, from my perspective, should be doing towards the conflict is showing equal empathy to the victims on both sides. So I think that's one thing that hasn't been happening, from my perception, hasn't been happening sufficiently is the showing empathy with the victims also on the Israeli side. And that's partly, I think it's partly due to the nature of much of feminist criticism as well, because Israel generally is the occupying force and is thus generally seen as the powerful actor. But in this case, clearly, Hamas took the war to women's bodies. I think that's also should be accentuated. That there have been a lot of cases of horrific sexual violence before women were killed, and this was clearly. I mean, there's some interviews that have been shown by Hamas fighters that were caught. That was clearly a specific goal to inflict bodily harm on women and thereby reach the nation. So it's kind of militarized masculinities to its extreme, and showing empathy with this just as much as with the many victims in Gaza that are obviously also not being taken care of or not being considered by the IDF or by the Israeli government. And I think there's one thing that I'll also add to this where it might be interesting to engage Israel particularly with, because Hamas on the other hand is not a feminist actor. They are clearly an Islamist organization, very male dominated, and also not keen on the civil population either in Gaza or in Israel. Israel, on the contrary, while it's not a member of the FFP countries, it was part of the FFP Plus group. So just 3 weeks prior to the 7th October attack, there was a meeting in the UN where Israel actually committed to engaging and to empowering women, to supporting women in all work. So that even though we have a far-right government, the most far-right government in Israel at the moment, there are places to start, and there are also, it's difficult to imagine at the time, but there used to be at least lots of grassroots, state-to-state, society-to-society organizations that were working between the West Bank and Israel, but difficult with Gaza because of the border regime. But there are civil society movements that have always been trying to cross this divide. It's very, very hard to see. However, I don't really know what a feminist foreign policy would say to a revival of a two-state solution or something else, but I think this is something that has to be done for the post-conflict. The one thing I would finally finish with is, to get to my earlier point, that there has to be clear accountability. So I think just today or yesterday, the ICC head prosecutor came to visit Israel, and he's been also going to Ramallah, I think, to the West Bank, so that there are attempts to hold the perpetrators to account for crimes committed against civilians and on both sides. Yeah.
Is there any other question or comment? I think there is no. Dr. Frahm, thank you again very much for this very comprehensive and very insightful speech. And I also would like to thank the audience for your coming and for your active participation, and hope to meet at another event at TED University. And also many thanks to Zuhal Hocam, to the Department of Political Science International Relations, TEDU Center for Gender Studies, and of course to Heinrich Böll Stiftung as well.
Thank you very much as well, and thank you for your patience and interest.
We would like to say thank you. Thank you. We would like to say thank you for all your efforts and your presentation. This is a foundation for the Turkish Education Foundation in memory of today. On behalf of your name, we have made a donation there. And the same for you, Birgül Hocam. Thank you so much. Thank you. Maybe we can have a picture together.
Much better than flowers.
Yes.